Imagine you're a German general in August 1944. You have spent weeks watching your entire world collapse around you. The Americans are to your south, the British and Canadians are pressing down from the north. The French countryside that you once controlled with an iron grip is slowly, methodically being turned into a killing ground. And somewhere behind you, the exit is closing. Slowly at first, then all at once. This is the story of the Falaise Pocket, the moment when Germany did not just lose a battle, it lost an entire army, and with it, any realistic chance of holding France. But to understand why Falaise happened, we need to go back just a few weeks, because the disaster at Falaise was not inevitable. In fact, if you had been watching the situation in late July 1944, you might have thought Germany still had a fighting chance. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, had succeeded, but the weeks that followed were brutal and grinding. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the dense network of earthen walls and thick vegetation that divided the French countryside into tiny compartments, turned out to be one of the most effective natural defences anyone could have imagined. German defenders could hold up entire divisions with just a handful of men and a couple of machine guns hidden in those hedgerows. American, British and Canadian soldiers were dying by the thousands, trying to push just a few miles inland. By mid-July, the Allied beachhead was dangerously congested. Millions of men, thousands of vehicles, mountains of supplies, all crammed into a relatively small area of Normandy. The Germans were bleeding too, but they were making the Allies pay dearly for every single field. Then, everything changed. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. The Americans had spent weeks planning a massive aerial bombardment, followed by an armoured breakout attempt. When it finally happened, it worked beyond anyone's expectations. American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German positions, and while the bombing also tragically killed a number of American soldiers due to short drops, what it did to the German lines was catastrophic. An entire German division was essentially obliterated. The defensive line cracked. General Omar Bradley's First Army poured through the gap, and then General George Patton's newly activated Third Army came roaring through behind them. Patton was exactly the kind of commander this moment demanded. Aggressive, fast, almost reckless in his willingness to push forward and let supply lines worry about themselves later. His armour fanned out into the open country of Brittany and then swept east toward Paris at speeds that seemed almost impossible given how slow the previous weeks had been. Now here is where the story gets truly extraordinary. And this is where Adolf Hitler himself enters the picture in a way that will seal the fate of the German Seventh Army. Any rational military analysis of the situation in early August 1944 would have called for an immediate German withdrawal eastward. Pull back to the Seine River, establish a new defensive line, consolidate what forces remain. Standard military doctrine. Basic common sense. Retreat to fight another day. Hitler ordered the exact opposite. He looked at the map and saw something that his generals absolutely did not see. He noticed that Patton's Third Army, in its lightning advance westward and then turning south, had created a long exposed northern flank. And where there is an exposed flank, there is an opportunity for a counterattack. If German armoured divisions could punch through the American lines near the town of Mortain, drive all the way to the coast at Avranches, they could cut off the entire American spearhead. They could sever Patton's supply lines. They could turn the whole situation around. On paper, it was not an insane idea. Flanking attacks that sever supply lines have won battles throughout history. The problem was this. Germany, in August 1944, did not have the resources, the air cover, the fuel or the manpower to execute such an operation. And Hitler's generals knew it. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, knew it. The panzer generals knew it. But orders were orders. Operation Lettich began on August 7, 1944. German armoured divisions, scraped together from across the front, launched their attack toward Mortain and Avranches. And for a few hours in the darkness of the early morning, it actually seemed to be working. The Americans were surprised. Some ground was taken. Then the sun came up. Allied air power in Normandy by August 1944 was simply overwhelming. The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force and the US AAF's 9th Air Force had thousands of aircraft available, and their fighter bombers, particularly the British Typhoons armed with rockets, turned the roads and fields around Mortain into an absolute graveyard of burning German armour. The counterattack stalled. Then it collapsed. And here is the crucial point that makes everything that follows so devastating for Germany. While Hitler was ordering his best remaining panzer divisions to attack westward toward Avranches, the Allied trap was closing from the north and south simultaneously. Let us look at the map. Picture a rough circle. At the western end of this circle is the town of Argentan in the south, held by American forces. At the northern edge is the town of Falaise, which the Canadians and Poles were fighting toward. The German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army were inside this circle, and every day those German forces pushed westward toward Avranches. Following Hitler's orders, the more deeply they pushed themselves into the closing trap. General Bradley saw it. Patton saw it even more clearly. Patton was practically begging to be allowed to close the gap from the south. His forces had swung east and were approaching Argentan. The Canadians were hammering southward toward Falaise with incredible determination, paying an enormous price in blood to take every single kilometre. The plan was simple and brilliant. Canadians and Poles close from the north, Americans close from the south. They meet somewhere around the town of Troun or Chambois. The German 7th Army is completely encircled. The war in France effectively ends. Simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. The fighting on the Canadian and Polish side of the pocket was some of the most intense and costly of the entire Northwest European campaign. Operation Totalize and then Operation Tractable, the successive Canadian attempts to push south toward Falaise, ran into ferocious German resistance. The Germans knew exactly what was at stake. They were not fighting just to hold ground, they were fighting to keep the escape route open for tens of thousands of their comrades inside the pocket. The 12th SS Panzer Division, among the most fanatical and capable German formations in Normandy, fought with desperate intensity to hold the Falaise gap open. Every kilometre the Canadians advanced cost them dearly. Young men from across Canada and from the Polish forces who had come so far from their occupied homeland were dying in those Norman fields in early August 1944. Meanwhile, inside the pocket itself, the situation for the German forces was deteriorating by the hour. The Allied air forces had essentially total control of the sky. Every road, every bridge, every assembly area was under constant attack. German columns trying to move, trying to reorganize, trying to bring up fuel and ammunition were being destroyed from the air continuously. And yet, Hitler still refused to authorize a general withdrawal. The counterattack toward Avranches was supposed to resume. More men were supposed to die attacking westward while the trap closed around them. The commanders on the ground were in an impossible position. Field Marshal von Kluge was sending increasingly desperate messages back to Hitler's headquarters, trying to explain the reality of the situation. Hitler's response was to accuse his generals of defeatism and demand they attack. Now add one more layer of complexity to this already catastrophic situation for Germany. July 20th, just weeks before all of this, had been the date of the famous assassination attempt against Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. A bomb, planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, had gone off in the conference room. Hitler had survived, but the consequences for the German military were profound. Hundreds of officers were arrested, tortured, and executed. The atmosphere in the German High Command was poisonous with suspicion. Generals who disagreed with Hitler now risked not just professional consequences, but their lives. Speaking truth to power had literally become life-threatening. Von Kluge himself was under suspicion of involvement in the July 20th plot. He knew it. And that knowledge made the already impossible situation even worse, because raising objections to Hitler's orders now carried an extra layer of mortal danger. Eventually, reality simply overrode all of Hitler's demands. Around August 12th and 13th, the decision was effectively made at the field level to begin pulling forces out of the pocket. But by this point, the window was dangerously narrow. Let us talk about what was actually happening inside that pocket, because the human reality of what those German soldiers experienced in those days needs to be understood to grasp the full scale of what was happening. The pocket was roughly oval-shaped, perhaps 20 miles long and a dozen miles wide at its widest point, and it was shrinking daily. Inside it were somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 German soldiers, along with their vehicles, artillery, horses, wounded men, the accumulated supplies and equipment of two armies. The constant Allied air attacks had turned the roads and fields into chaos. Dead horses and burned-out vehicles choked every route. Wounded men who could not be evacuated lay in fields and farmyards. Officers trying to maintain any kind of unit cohesion found themselves commanding fragments of formations that no longer existed as fighting units. The psychological pressure was immense. These soldiers could hear the artillery from all sides. They knew they were surrounded. Many of them knew that the exit was closing and that time was running out. Yet many of them continued to fight. And this is one of the most remarkable and sobering aspects of the Falaise story. Even in conditions of near total collapse, even under constant air and artillery bombardment, even knowing that the strategic situation was hopeless, enough German soldiers maintained enough cohesion to keep the gap open longer than the Allies anticipated. The gap near Chambois and the area around the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives became the focal point of some of the most savage fighting of the entire campaign. Canadian, Polish and American forces were trying to close the gap. German forces outside the pocket, particularly SS Panzer units, were attacking from outside, trying to keep it open. The result was a battle within a battle. A brutal, confused struggle over a few square miles of Norman countryside, through which tens of thousands of men were trying to escape. The 1st Polish Armoured Division, fighting as part of the Canadian First Army, played a particularly remarkable role in these final days. Positioned on a feature called Hill 262, known to the Poles as the Machuga, or Mace, they found themselves holding a crucial blocking position while simultaneously being attacked from inside and outside the pocket. German forces inside the pocket were trying to break out past them. German forces outside were trying to break through to them. The Poles held their position with extraordinary tenacity, under attack from all directions, running low on ammunition, taking heavy casualties, but refusing to let the escape route fully reopen. The gap was finally sealed on August 19th, 1944, when Canadian and Polish forces linked up with American forces near Chambois. But some German forces had already escaped, and this becomes one of the great controversies of the entire Normandy campaign. Why was the gap not closed sooner? Could the Allies have trapped and destroyed even more of the German forces? The question particularly focuses on a decision made around August 12th and 13th, when Patton's forces were approaching Argentan from the south and were relatively close to the Canadian forces pushing down from Falaise. A swift advance by American armour at that moment might have closed the pocket several days earlier, trapping far more German troops before they could escape. Bradley ordered Patton's forces to halt at Argentan and not push further north into what was designated as the Canadian Operational Zone. The reasons were partly about preventing friendly fire incidents between converging forces, and partly about concerns over whether Patton had enough forces to hold such a long line. Bradley later wrote about this decision in ways that suggested he found it painful, knowing what might have been achieved. Patton, characteristically, was furious. He believed he could have closed the gap and wanted permission to try. He did not get it. Whether he was right is one of those historical what-ifs that can never be fully resolved. What can be measured is what happened to the German forces that did not escape. The destruction inside the Falaise Pocket when it was finally closed was on a scale that shocked even soldiers who had seen years of combat. The area through which the Germans had been trying to escape, the corridor around Saint-Lambert and Chambois, was afterward described by Allied commanders and journalists who walked through it as one of the most terrible sights of the entire war. General Dwight Eisenhower himself visited the area after the fighting ended and wrote that you could walk for hundreds of yards stepping on nothing but dead bodies. Dead horses were everywhere. Burned tanks and vehicles were jammed into every road. The smell was indescribable. Exact numbers are difficult to pin down even today, but the scale of German losses was catastrophic. Somewhere between 40 and 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner inside the pocket. Estimates of German dead range widely, but likely number in the tens of thousands. More than 500 tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed or abandoned. Vast quantities of artillery, trucks, horses and equipment were lost. The German 7th Army, which had been one of the most powerful formations in the German order of battle just weeks earlier, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Multiple corps and divisions that had been the backbone of German resistance in Normandy simply ceased to exist. Of the German forces that did escape the pocket, most were exhausted, shell-shocked men who had thrown away their heavy weapons and equipment to move faster. They were not formations capable of immediate further resistance. The German military catastrophe of Falaise was only compounded in the following days and weeks as Allied forces pursued the fleeing Germans eastward toward the Seine, catching additional formations and destroying even more German strength. The numbers of Germans who made it across the Seine River with their equipment were tragically small compared to what had existed before. The Wehrmacht had suffered what historians would later estimate was a loss of equipment roughly equivalent to what Germany had lost at Stalingrad. 300,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in Normandy overall, with the Falaise Pocket accounting for a significant portion of those losses. Now let us zoom out and think about what this all meant strategically, because the significance of Falaise extends far beyond the tactical destruction of two German armies. France was liberated with extraordinary speed after Falaise. Paris rose in revolt and was liberated on August 25, 1944, just days after the pocket was sealed. Allied forces raced across France and Belgium at speeds that seemed almost impossible to people who remembered the grinding, slow progress of those early weeks in Normandy. Brussels fell on September 3rd, Antwerp on September 4th. The German front in the west had simply collapsed. This speed had enormous consequences. It meant that the liberation of France came far sooner than anyone had dared hope, saving lives, saving the French population from continued occupation and the suffering that came with it. It meant that the momentum of Allied operations was maintained in a way that threatened to end the war in Europe before 1944 was out. That it did not end in 1944 is a story for another day, involving the failure of Market Garden in the Netherlands in September, the exhaustion of Allied supply lines that had been stretched far beyond their design limits, and the German counter-offensive in the Ardennes in December. But none of those subsequent events can diminish what was achieved at Falaise. Let us also think about the human dimension of this victory, because victories on this scale are easy to describe in terms of maps and numbers, while the actual human cost gets lost in the statistics. The men who fought to close the Falaise Pocket paid an enormous price. The Canadians suffered heavily in their drive toward Falaise, with the battles of Totalize and Tractable adding significantly to what was already one of the most costly campaigns the Canadian military had ever fought. Young Canadians from every province, young Polish soldiers who were fighting in part for the eventual liberation of their own occupied homeland far to the east, young Americans who had come from another continent to fight in someone else's country. On the German side, the suffering inside the pocket was on a different scale of horror. Whatever we think of the German war aims, whatever judgment history renders on the regime those soldiers served, the human experience of being trapped in that pocket under constant bombardment from the air, unable to move without being attacked, watching comrades die, running out of everything, that was a particular kind of hell. German accounts of the Falaise Pocket consistently use language that tries to capture the apocalyptic nature of what those days felt like. There is something important to understand about the relationship between Hitler's decisions and the catastrophe at Falaise. The German High Command did not walk into this trap through incompetence or bad luck alone. They were pushed into it by a command structure that by 1944 had become genuinely dysfunctional. Hitler's insistence on the Mortain counterattack, his refusal to authorize timely withdrawals, his deepening suspicion of his own generals, all of these factors contributed directly to the scale of the disaster. This was not unique to Falaise. The same pattern had played out at Stalingrad in 1942 to 1943, where Hitler's refusal to allow the Sixth Army to break out when it might still have been possible contributed enormously to the scale of that catastrophe. It would play out again and again in the final years of the war. A pattern of holding positions that could not be held, of counterattacking when withdrawal was the only rational option, of treating the requests of frontline commanders as expressions of defeatism rather than military reality. The Falaise Pocket was, in this sense, both a military catastrophe and a kind of case study in how a command structure that has lost touch with reality can amplify every tactical and strategic disadvantage until what might have been a serious defeat becomes an existential one. For the Allies, Falaise was a moment of vindication. The plan for Operation Overlord had been built on the assumption that once a sufficient lodgment was established and enough German forces were committed to defending Normandy, a breakout would eventually be possible and the Germans would be caught in an unfavourable situation. Falaise was the fulfilment of that plan on a scale that exceeded even the most optimistic Allied projections from earlier in the summer. It was also a demonstration of what genuine combined arms warfare looks like when it functions as intended. The artillery, the air power, the armour, the infantry, the logistics organisations, all of these elements working together with a degree of coordination that the German military, for all its tactical skill, simply could not match in 1944. Germany was fighting at this point in the war with less of everything that matters at the operational and strategic level. Less fuel, less air cover, less industrial capacity, less manpower. Falaise exposed all of those deficits simultaneously. There is one more element of this story that deserves attention, and it concerns what happened to the German commanders involved. Field Marshal von Kluge, caught between Hitler's increasingly unhinged orders and the catastrophic reality of the situation on the ground, was relieved of command on August 17, 1944, as the Pocket was in its final collapse. He was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. On his way back to Germany, knowing he was under suspicion for involvement in the July 20th plot and almost certainly facing arrest and execution, von Kluge took poison and died. He left behind a letter to Hitler in which he reportedly argued that Germany should seek peace, that the war was lost. Whether Hitler read it with any genuine engagement is unknown. Von Kluge's fate illuminates something important about the broader context of the war at this stage. Germany was not just losing battles, it was losing the war, and some of the most senior German officers knew it. The question was no longer whether Germany would ultimately be defeated. The question was how many more people would die before that defeat was acknowledged. The answer to that question, as history shows, was millions more. Falaise, therefore, sits at a particular crossroads in the history of the Second World War. It is the moment when the strategic outcome of the campaign in the West became truly irreversible. There was no scenario after Falaise in which Germany could have expelled the Allies from France. The forces required for such a reversal simply no longer existed. The factories of Germany were still producing weapons, and the Wehrmacht would fight on for another 9 months. But the fundamental trajectory of the war in the West was determined in those Norman fields in August 1944. For France, the liberation that followed came with its own complexity. The joy of freedom was mixed with the reckoning that follows occupation. The questions about collaboration and resistance, the physical destruction of Norman towns and villages that had been caught in the middle of one of history's most destructive battles. Cities like Caen had been reduced to rubble. Countless villages throughout Normandy bore the scars of the fighting. The civilian population of Normandy had endured months of bombing, shelling, and the particular chaos of an active battle zone moving through their homes and fields. Today, if you visit Normandy, you can stand in the American military cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer above Omaha Beach. Or you can drive through the Falaise area and find the small monuments and memorials that mark what happened there. The Polish Memorial near Chambois, the Canadian cemetery where young men from places like Ontario and Manitoba and British Columbia lie buried in French soil. The museum at Falaise itself that preserves the memory of those August days. These places hold something important. They are reminders that the decisions made in grand headquarters, the orders issued by generals, the strategic calculations of statesmen, all of these things ultimately translate into individual human experiences. Into a 22-year-old Canadian soldier trying to hold a position on a hillside while being attacked from 2 directions. Into a German soldier trying to walk east fast enough to get out before the gap closed. Into a French family hiding in a cellar, listening to the world destroy itself above them. The Falaise Pocket lasted roughly 2 weeks from the beginning of Operation Lettich to the closing of the gap. In those 2 weeks, the war in the West was decided. An entire German army was destroyed. France, was liberated. The road to Germany was opened. History sometimes turns on moments that, in retrospect, feel inevitable. The chain of cause and effect, once you trace it backward, seems almost logical. Of course the Mortown counterattack failed. Of course the pocket closed. Of course Hitler's stubbornness turned a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. But nothing about it was inevitable in the moments when it was happening. People were making decisions under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, in conditions of physical and psychological extremity. The courage of the Polish soldiers on Hill 262, outnumbered and attacked from all sides, was not inevitable. The decisions made by Canadian and American commanders to push forward despite heavy losses were not inevitable. The extraordinary effort of Allied logistics organizations to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to forces moving faster than any army in history had moved were not inevitable achievements. They were achievements of human will, human courage, and human organization. Placed against them was the human cost of a failed ideology's desperate attempt to maintain its grip through force of arms. Falaise is the story of how that attempt finally failed in France. And with it, the story of how France was freed. If this kind of deep dive into the decisive moments of the Second World War is what you are looking for, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. We go beyond the surface level, past the famous names and famous dates, and into the real story of what happened and why it mattered. Subscribe, leave a comment below with your thoughts on Falaise, and let us know what other battles or campaigns you want us to cover next. The next video is already coming.